Okay, welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video, and I am super privileged today to be joined by Gary McLelland. Who is Gary McLelland? If you don't know, he is the Chief Executive of Humanists International, has been since February 2017, before which he worked for the Humanist Society Scotland as Head of Communications and Public Affairs. He has also previously served as a board member of the European Humanist Federation based in Brussels. He has a BSc Honours in Psychology, a Diploma in Childhood and Youth Studies, and rather pertinent to what we're going to be talking about today, he has a Master's in Human Rights Law, in which he researched the approaches of the European Court of Human Rights and the United Nations to so-called blasphemy laws. That's pertinent because part of what the International Humanist and Ethical Union do is produce a report called the Freedom of Thought Report every year. And that is something that Gary is hopefully going to talk to us in some depth about. Anyway, Gary, welcome. And would you like to sort of introduce yourself a little bit more, give us an idea of who you are, and maybe how you got into humanism?
Sure. Well, thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to you today. Yeah, I mean, I guess in terms of how I get into humanism, I grew up in a small town just outside Glasgow, and I was raised in a sort of traditional Catholic way. And if you know anything about Glasgow and Scotland, you know we have this Catholic and non-denominational education system, which non-denominational people often erroneously think means secular, whereas in actual fact it means non-denominational Christian, or colloquially Protestant. So anyway, I was raised in this Catholic upbringing, and like a lot of people raised in the Catholic system in the west of Scotland, my family came from Ireland, so there was that connection. And I think when I became non-religious, which would have been in my teens, I went through a process which I think a lot of people did, of feeling very angry that the adults around about me in my youth never thought to tell me that like the entire belief system that I was brought up in was just one of many options available. You know, I genuinely thought until my early teens that everybody was a Catholic, because by virtue of the fact that in Glasgow we have this segregated education system, all of my friends were Catholic, all of my family of course were Catholic, and you know, I grew up in this world surrounded by the Catholic Church and Catholic people, so that was what got me interested in the idea of challenging religious orthodoxy and challenging my upbringing and so on. And I think like a lot of people, I went through the stage of being a bit cross about this and so on. And it wasn't until I found the Humanist Society Scotland, and I found a bunch of people who shared the frustration and anger that I had about the sort of segregated education system and the way in which the church didn't, I think, wasn't appropriately challenged about its policies, but they also had a positive outlook on life, which encompassed much more than a rejection and a criticism of religion.
Yeah.
So that for me was a really important thing.
So much to talk about even in that short, because a lot of viewers will be American, and just to give some kind of context to how parts of Scotland work, it's essentially the troubles in Northern Ireland, if you understand that in a sectarian manner, so your Catholic Protestants, you know, scenario, that's what it's like in Glasgow, for example. And you have football teams that represent that, so the Protestants will have Rangers, Catholics will have Celtic, and it's all part of a cultural divide, a tribalism, which I would argue that religion is co-opted to represent a form of identity. And I don't think realistically, I think the same in Northern Ireland. I don't think they're fighting over religion. I think they're fighting over you and us, and religion is a way of expressing that you and us, that tribalism. But anyway, also thrown into that is your interesting point about how the education system in the UK works. So different from America, we have, for example, 37% of our primary schools are religious faith schools, but they are state schools still. And this is because we are not a secular country in any kind of structural way. So if you're, imagine the challenges you felt you had, then being brought up in Riyadh, where the choices are like, you know, somewhat different. So, but you moved away from that. And did you even at that young age, even at that teenage age that you had, because it's not like a Bible Belt American who has been in religion for say 40 years and come out and has that resentment of having wasted or been having 40 years stolen off them. You were quite young, but you still felt that anger.
Yeah, I did. And I think partly I thought about this for a long time afterwards, because it was also quite an emotionally traumatic process to become non-religious for me personally. And I don't think that was common. And looking back on how the process was for me, I'm left with this impression that somehow I took the whole religion thing more seriously than other people. You know, when I reflect on like my religious education classes, it seems like there was somehow a memo that went around saying, okay, this is religion. It's not really as important as science and maths, but just, you know, don't say anything. And I feel like I didn't get that memo. And I think that's what made me feel more annoyed, was the fact that I felt a little bit embarrassed that I actually believed it all, you know. Whereas a lot of
Right.
my peers seem to, you know, maybe they believed or they didn't really think about it. But when, as a lot of my friends have that I went to school with, have become non-religious, it doesn't seem a bother to them.
I mean, the British sort of religious scenario is very different from the American one again, where, and I don't, maybe the English is actually different from, say, a Glaswegian experience here, but there's a lot of apathy with religion in Britain. It's just not a part of our lives. And
Yeah.
so when someone like myself, I'm like super interested and geeky, and this is everything about me is about religion or lack of religion. For 99% of people, or a great proportion of people in England, it's just not on the radar. It's not a thing that you think about every day, especially as a teenager. So I do get that.
Yeah. So that I found very interesting, and so that I guess was what sparked my interest in this whole thing. And then when I got in touch and joined the Humanist Society Scotland,
What age was that?
that would have been, I guess, in my late teens, early 20s, something like that. And at that time, you know, I would go along to meetings, and the Humanist Society Scotland does a whole range of like community activities and things, which I found really interesting. And a few years down the line, I ended up working for them, because at that time I was working in the social work department in Glasgow. Um, I studied psychology, I think, as you mentioned, and my original plan was to become a psychologist, but I did an internship and I think I wasn't very good at it, and it just didn't really suit me. So I sort of went through this process of trying to figure out what it was I wanted to do. And at that time, I was volunteering and doing a little bit of work for the Humanist Society Scotland. And that's when I then decided to go back and get my master's in human rights law. And that's what kind of took me down this path. But during the time I worked at Humanist Society Scotland, I did, I think, what would be one of the most interesting things in my career so far, which was helped to take forward one of the first ever judicial reviews against the Scottish Government on the basis of children's rights. And what we did was we managed to get the money together to challenge the fact that in Scotland, which is different to England, in Scotland, children in schools are not legally allowed to opt out of going to prayers.
Right. So for those who don't know, it was certainly in England, this is known as collective worship, and collective worship is still a statutory requirement for English schools that is Christian worship. So it is actually, you know, this is a vast difference between America and the UK, where we're less religious, but we are far less secular as well.
Yeah.
And so we still have built into the system, and I say this as a former teacher, built into the system, you know, a Christian collective worship that, although many schools don't necessarily follow that to the T, it is still a statutory requirement. So sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah, no. And I think your American viewers will find this completely mind-blowing, I think. But yeah, so the law in Scotland basically doesn't, I think the law in England is something like, it's case law, and it's something like children who have the mental faculties of 13 plus or something. I think it's called the Gillick competence, is this sort of legal test. They can opt themselves out of going to prayers if they are sort of old enough and deemed to be responsible enough. In Scotland, because of the slightly different legal system, we don't have that law. So basically, if you want, and the school age in Scotland goes right up to 18, of course, I think, like England. And so basically, if you're 18 or under and you don't want to go to prayers, which could take place in a church or it could take place in the school, you're not allowed to. You have to get a permission from your parents, and we thought that was outrageous. So we took the Scottish Government to court, and we argued on the UN Declaration on the Rights of the Child and so on. And that was one of the most interesting things I ever did in my career. And anyway, and then I ended up working at Humanists International and so on. But that was kind of one of the most interesting things that I'd done. And I guess one other thing maybe just to mention, because you mentioned about your US viewers, one of the other ways in which, because I think you made the good point there, which is that when you say, prayers are mandatory in UK schools, it sounds horrific. But of course, in practice, as you'll know as a teacher, it's much more mushy. And, maybe one week they'll get in the local minister, but maybe the next week they'll get in a local, somebody else to talk about something vaguely to do with feelings and philosophy and stuff. So there's a lot of what goes on in practice, which is probably unobjectionable.
Yeah, a lot of it is literally in class. It's not even as a whole school thing. So a lot of the time it's in class, and you'll have just a reflective period, or it can be interpreted. It depends what your management structure is. So it can be really liberally interpreted. But yeah,
and I think, but for us, obviously, the concern was there is a legal framework there which allows for these really bad things. And the same is true, I think, with the Catholic school situation in Scotland. So I went through the Catholic education system, and apart from my particular sort of existential paranoia about becoming a non-religious person, the education I got was largely good. The school I went to was one of the most high achieving in the area. There were a few things which I think were particular to the fact that it was Catholic. So there was, I know some LGBT people who were horrendously bullied. I can't prove that was worse because it was a Catholic school, but I think it was. And it was a whole bunch of stuff like that. But one of the things that, like with the collective worship, which makes it really problematic, is the schools are paid for and run by the state nominally. So the teachers are employed by the state. However, the Catholic Church retains management oversight over them. So I know that there is a gay teacher in Scotland who was refused a promotion because the Catholic Church would not approve the promotion. And I think it's these little details of where
I could go on for hours about this, because I'm actually legally bound to confidentiality, so I can't say certain things.
Oh, okay.
But I have been involved directly with such. So the important thing to note here is that faith schools in the UK opt out of human rights legislation. So you think that human rights are universal in the sense of, at least they're declared to be universal, and we write documents to say they're universal, and we adhere to the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And yet our education system opts out, faith schools opt out of human rights legislation. So if you're I knew a divorced deputy head who was unable to take the headship of a Catholic school because he was divorced. He was a divorcee and remarried. And I have also been on the receiving end of working in a faith school and then no longer working in a faith school due to my beliefs. And but that would never be able to happen in a properly non-denominational school, in a state non-denominational school. And the frustrating thing is that the diocese only have to provide 10% of any new building that is built. So you've got a whole school and all the costs of the school, and it's actually the taxpayer who's paying 100% of the running of that school. It is a state school, but the diocese get the control over the curricula and the management of that school, and they only put their hands in their pockets when a new building is built, and they have to provide 10%, which is why the admin office takes that money usually from the parents in a like £10 a term requirement or donation from parents. So actually the diocese doesn't even largely pay a lot of that, because they get it from the parents. Anyway, man, the whole system is screwed.
Yeah, sorry, maybe a parochial start for sort of international audience.
Yes.
But yeah,
but well, that's really interesting. So then you get involved in humanism as far as Scotland's concerned, and then you move to the international humanists. So what is the name of the international humanists, and what do they represent? What is the organization?
So, as you said, so the organization was founded in 1952 as the International Humanist and Ethical Union. In 2019, we changed our name to Humanists International to try and, make it a bit easier to say. I was hired in 2017. I actually attended my first international meeting in 2016, where I went to Malta for what's called the General Assembly. So Humanists International is the global umbrella body for humanist and other kind of ethical non-religious organizations. So it was founded in 1952 by 5 organizations: the American Humanist Association, American Ethical Union, the British Humanist Association, or Humanist UK, the Dutch Humanist Organization, and one other which I've forgotten for the moment, which I think was the Swiss Humanists. Can't remember. The Vienna Ethical Society, maybe.
Austria.
Anyway, Austria. Yes, that sounds right. And basically, so our members are humanist organizations. So we exist to sort of support them, to help them, and to give a voice to them. So we do that in many different ways. We have a growth and development program where we give out grants to organizations in developing countries or new and emerging organizations. We also support them by giving them access to training and resources. And we have a caseworker who helps to provide support to humanists at risk in various parts of the world where they need, help with asylum or letters of support and so on. And then we also represent them. So we have a team of people who represent humanist ideas and humanist organizations at the United Nations and various institutions around the world. So that's kind of in a nutshell what we do.
So a lot of support plus some lobbying in ways that pales into insignificance compared to religious bodies around the world.
Oh, absolutely.
The amount of money. I remember writing something about this a couple of years ago, again in the context of America, talking about how much sort of the AHA in America, the American Humanist Association, has come such a long way, and it is now a political lobbying body to some degree, but the money that it has at its disposal is like a drop in the ocean compared to lobbying in America. Is ridiculous. So, and I presume the same sort of thing is the case in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we are outgunned by all of our sort of opponents. And you have the crazy situation as well at the United Nations, where the Catholic Church is represented as a state, through the ridiculous idea of the Holy See. So there's just all of the kind of institutional power is stacked against people like us who want to represent a non-religious, ethical, progressive cause. The good thing, though, is, or the benefit that we have that helps us, I think, punch way above our weight, is that our ideas are really good. We have the benefit that the stuff that we're trying to promote is really good ideas.
Intuitively, I mean, surely, unless you're being really conservatively ideologically religious, I mean, it's intuitively, your average Joe, your apathetic average Joe would be like, yeah, that's clearly a good idea. There's kind of like intuitive moral proclamations. Yeah, definitely. So one of the things the IHEU, or now Humanists International, does is produce the Freedom of Thought report every year. That's a unique annual report and online resource looking at the rights and treatment of humanists and the non-religious generally in every country in the world. And just reading from the general introduction to the 2021 report. Specifically, this report looks at how non-religious individuals, whether they call themselves atheists, agnostics, humanists, freethinkers, or are otherwise just simply not religious, are treated because of their lack of religion or absence of belief in God. We focus on discrimination by state authorities, that is systemic, legal, or official forms of discrimination and restrictions on freedom of thought, belief, and expression, though we do also try to include some consideration of extra-legal persecution or persecution of non-state actors, social discrimination, and personal experience where possible. So that's just a broad overview of the report. What's your experience with generating this report? What can you tell us about the report in generalities?
So the report was established, or the first edition came out in 2012. It was actually a collaboration between us, the US State Department, and the American Humanist Association, the first one. And at that point, it covered, I think, 20 or 30 countries of specific concern. And over the last 10 years, it's evolved into this report, which is, it's much more like a wiki. You know, it's so we have a website which is fot.humanists.international, which is, I guess, a bit of a long URL actually now that I say it out loud. But if you Google Freedom of Thought report, you'll find it. And we have a page on every single country in the world, apart from the pseudo state of the Vatican, which we don't consider.
What I like about that website as well is when you go and look at the report, the way you've divvied up the report is you split it into their component parts, but you can look at the preface of the 2021 report, and then straight below it's a 2020 report and then the 2019 report. So you can actually compare prefaces through time and compare general introductions through. I quite like that. So there's a comparability, if that's a word, of the reports. But carry on.
And I think that's, for us, that's an important part of it, which is we're quite a small organization. So I think people often imagine us as having, like 100 staff all around the world. We have 10 staff that do all of the work that you see. It's really a small operation. We rely on the help of our members. So many of our member organizations are much bigger than us, and they can help us because they are much more plugged into what's happening in their national organization. So for example, in the US, we rely on the American Humanist Association and American Atheists. They know far more about the detail of what's going on, and they can report to us what's actually happening. But the ability to compare is really important for us. And that's why the report, we've been very open about our challenges with methodology. You mentioned there in the kind of introduction that this report measures is much more skewed towards hard indicators like laws and policies and things that people can research sitting at a computer. And the US is
that's quantifiable data.
Exactly. And the US is an interesting sort of case study, because we get quite a lot of criticism most years, fairly, I think, that the US scores very highly. And the reason it scores very highly, of course, is because of the constitutional protections that are afforded to people and the state secularism. Now, of course, I know that in practice, there is a lot of problematic aspects of how religion intersects with the law in the US. And to a much bigger extent, there's a huge issue with the way in which religion or non-religion is perceived socially and the barriers and stigmas that are attached to that. The difficult thing is, without doing a really expensive and in-depth social study on that, it's difficult for us to be able to quantify it. And it's even more difficult for us to be able to compare it to other countries. So if you look at, for example, American Atheists, they do a report, I think it's called State of the Secular States report, where they actually do this social research into what's it like being an atheist or a humanist in the Bible Belt, or what's it like being, an LGBT person.
So more of a qualitative assessment. Yeah.
Exactly. And so there's a lot of good data out there, but for us, because we want to try and give a global perspective, it's difficult because, we might have good data on one country, but not on another. And it's difficult for us to compare. So we are very limited by the fact that we don't have a massive team of researchers, and therefore we rely much more on quantifiable legal data and so on, which is definitely a weakness of the report, because reading the report doesn't give you an idea of what it's like to be a humanist in these countries. It gives you an idea of how the law and the policy is disposed to you as a humanist. So that's one problem. At the same time, we just try to be upfront about this. This is the best we can do with the resources we have, and
it's a start as well. I mean, you can imagine such a report in 10 years' time might include that more of that qualitative data as humanism grows. I mean, the world is secularizing, as you say here. A detailed survey in 2012, again, that's 9 years out of date, revealed that religious people make up 59% of the world's population. While they identify as atheist, while those who identify as atheists make up 13%, and an additional 23% specify or identify as non-religious, while not self-identifying as atheist. So atheism and the non-religious population are growing rapidly. Religion dropped by 9 percentage points, and atheism rose by 3 percentage points between 2005 and 2012. Again, 9 years out of date. And that religion declines in proportion to the rise in education and personal income, which is a trend that looks set to continue. So we are seeing a secularization of the world in general. America is definitely an interesting indication of this. Nowadays, those they're saying, well, 25% easily would be non-religious. The nuns are religious nuns, but probably nearer to 30% plus. And then the interesting, as we talked about America a little bit, is that how many politicians there are openly atheist. Well, actually none. I think one identifies as secular or something like that, is not quite, doesn't, refuses to say atheist, but is an atheist. And then you've got Kirsten Sinema, I think, who's very careful with their words, but really it's not 30%, right? Or it's not 25%,
yeah,
it's
yeah,
not
yeah.
20%, it's like 2 at most sort of identify as non-religious. So yeah, but so the findings of the report show that a lot of countries do fail in respect to the rights of humanist atheists. In what ways do they fail?
So that's yes. I mean, the picture is quite grim. I mean, from this year's report we have published, we talk about humanists and non-religious people being discriminated against legally in 144 countries. There's a state religion or a lack of secularism in 39 countries. We have government figures or government leaders marginalizing or harassing or inciting hatred or violence against the non-religious in 12 countries. Apostasy, leaving religion, is a criminal offence in 17 countries, and you can get a death penalty or a death sentence in 12 of those countries. There's discriminatory funding of religious organisations in 79 countries, and it's actually illegal or almost impossible to run or open a humanist or atheist organisation in 16 countries around the world. So it's a pretty grim picture, and I think part of what we do with this report and our work generally is to try to make the point that in recent years, at the policy level anyway, the concept of equal treatment of religions has become kind of standard, you know, and we understand the need for secularism and so on. But for some reason, with the progress, with that progress in the human rights field, the treatment of non-religious people, of humanists and atheists, people that have a coherent worldview, a positive understanding of the world and their orientation in it, which just happens not to be religious, those people are not included in the collection of people deemed worthy of protection and respect. And that is something that we're trying to highlight and to say, look, these human rights protections must be extended. And as you said, to not just to a sort of small group of people, but to a growing, and in many countries here in Europe, a majority of the population.
Yeah, the British Attitude Survey, I think, has us non-religious at 52% in I don't know if that's England or the UK, but actually Scotland's interesting even more so, because you actually have legalized humanist marriages up there, which are now the most common form of religious marriage, so to speak. So it's, if you're looking at where the world is going, you want to get on this train, you know, because this is going places. Now, I wonder whether the success of humanism or non-religion, or the potential or the perceived future success of non-religion, is what is making people, making states and countries and other nations and groups get ultra defensive. So maybe the persecution is rising as a reaction to a perceived threat of humanism as it's growing. I don't know.
There's an interesting point there, I think, which is that over the last, let's say, 5 years, we've seen this really big rise again of nationalism, of you know, putting up barriers again, and a regression away from the concept of universality and towards you know, an old sort of my country first sort of attitude. And I think in that, let's take the example of India. We know that the government in India is promoting a vision of Indianness, which is much more wedded to Hindu nationalism than has been the case in the past, and certainly in the historical past in India, which was much more pluralistic and so on. And we can, if we look at the United States, we can see that again with, you know, the rise of evangelical supporters with Trump and all these different ideas. So in that sense, I think you might be right that there is an othering of non-religious people, because people want to attach, and we take Putin's Russia as well, you know, the re-emergence of the Orthodox Church as the kind of bulwark for their traditional values, which is
and the fundamentalist Orthodox Church. And Putin, he's a sly old fox. You know, he gets into bed with the Orthodox Church because he can use that mechanism, use that structure, that system to further his own aims and goals. But yeah. So, and I think you know, it's a real challenge. I was wondering whether statistically things are getting worse. So is the 2021 report showing that a worse state of affairs for humanists or non-religious people around the world than the 2020 report?
Well, we can't really compare year on year like that, because the way that we do it, we update 1/3 of the countries on a rolling program. So it's difficult to make annual comparisons. I mean, the trends which we identify are, I think, getting worse, you know. So we've seen, and this is something which the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief has commented on, that when humanists and non-religious people are attacked, it's much more vicious and much more fierce than other people. And there is this concept that there's a sort of hatred, a sort of a ferocity in which non-religious people are targeted. And like what you were saying a minute ago, I think it's linked to not just the fact of they're seen as rejecting nationalism, but it's also the fact that most people who are humanist non-religious activists, they will also be people who occupy the spaces of pro-LGBT activism, pro-democracy activism, open society activists, and it's obviously no surprise that those people share, you know, the identity labels, are fellow progressives essentially. So when humanists are attacked, it's often for multiple for multiple reasons.
Because I was going to make comment on the fact that the report generally, it doesn't just keep itself to ideas of religiosity, but does, I don't know, I haven't read the report in full, but I think it sort of dips its toes into sort of LGBT and sort of other progressive social justice issues as maybe reflective or there's kind of synergy with the non-religious movement. And so, I would understand that, you know, pushback against a humanist is often pushback against these other progressive projects.
And it's an interesting point, that, because as you said, the report breaks down, it has sort of 4 areas. You know, it looks at education and family law and the constitution and various different aspects of a country. And I think the reason for that is very important. This report was launched at the US Congress, and it was in collaboration with the American Humanist Association, and our president, Andrew Copson, was speaking at the event live with Representative Jamie Raskin, who I think is one of the few openly, I don't know what he calls himself. I think he calls himself either a free thinker or a rationalist or something.
Yes, he is one of them. He is one that I wrote about. That says, is one of those interesting word choices. But
and Andrew was asked about that point of, you know, why do you include things like, for example, this year we put in 2 new indicators into the report, which was that a dominant religious, so in a particular country we might be concerned about, for example, where a dominant religious belief basically squeezes out the space for LGBT activism or you know, activism for other minority pursuits, because it's not so much that it's legally banned, but that the social space is so dominated by one religious idea. And the other one, the other boundary condition that we brought in, I just need to check my notes this year, was about the unregulated use of conscientious objection clauses. And again, this is a quite a sophisticated thing to unpack. So people should be, in some limited areas, it's believed, have the right to conscientiously object. You know, the classic example is provision of abortion. So it's been decided in many countries that where doctors provide abortions, that they should be allowed to object based on their personal beliefs and stuff. Now, I don't know whether that's right or wrong, but it's legal. If you take the example of Italy, so many doctors are opt out of that process that accessing an abortion service can become very difficult, or in some cases impossible. So we have here a tension between people have an individual right to opt out of providing it, but at the same time, women have a right to access that service. So we have to have some regulation to make sure that these things are not just banning services through the back door, if you like.
Because then to unpick that a little bit, what is motivating those doctors to do that? So is it the case that they genuinely do believe that, or is it they feel they have to opt out because if they don't, there are social or even, you know, personal safety issues with saying I'm fine with going through, you know, being a doctor of that procedure, you know. So it's one thing to say I'm going to object, but why is that, and you know, what is underwriting it?
Precisely, and we have, I can't confirm this, but there are reports that we've received that because a lot of hospitals in, for example, Italy are run by the Catholic Church, that there may also be people want to be, there's a performative expectation that you don't do it because you want to be perceived by the church who controls your promotions and blah, blah, blah. So there's all these issues. But anyway, the point I wanted to make was that when asked about this at the launch event, Andrew made what I thought was an excellent point. And he used the example of Mubarak Bala, who is the president of the Humanist Association of Nigeria, who was detained without charge in April 28th of April last year.
I think for the second, was that for the second time as well?
That was for the second time, yep. And he still remains in prison at the moment under spurious charges to do with his criticism of religious leaders in Nigeria. But Andrew made the good point that this didn't just happen overnight. Like, people didn't just decide one night to kidnap Mubarak and keep him in jail for 1.5 years on spurious charges. It happened because over a series of years, there's been a slow erosion of the concept of plurality, or the concept of secularism, or the concept of being open to other people with different beliefs and so on. And there's been a kind of gradual narrowing of the space in society and the available options for you to, you know, to have your different beliefs and attitudes. And so the reason it's important that our report captures all of these is because these can be early indicators that a country is heading in the wrong direction. So we need to have open, plural societies where different ideas can be aired and so on. And
but okay, sorry. Carry on. No, carry on.
And I guess that comes back to this idea that the kind of humanist ideal of an open society, you know, because if humanists were put in charge of the world or something, we wouldn't want everybody to be a humanist. We would want an even playing field for everybody to come together and to disagree
it's
well
about
with each other.
Equality of opportunity. I mean, the key phrase, I think, for all of everything is equality of opportunity, which is to say it's that level playing field. Like, I don't care I don't care if people are religious. I do. But I only care if they have moral impact on their fellow humans, right? That's when it becomes a problem. If you believe something that is untrue, that doesn't really bother me. I mean, it kind of does in a really strictly philosophical sense, and I'll get all geeky about it. But on a day-to-day basis, that doesn't worry me. It worries me when your untrue belief means that you then take a moral stance that is problematic for the people that live around you. That's a problem. So, yeah, you know, that plurality is something, you know, we shouldn't necessarily be against. You know, it gives a vibrancy maybe to life and a variety, which is the spice of life. But yeah, obviously certain countries are not working. So what do we do about that? Like, how do we encourage plurality and understanding and liberalism throughout the world?
Wow. Well, the way that we do it is our kind of theory of change for how to help organizations is, we think the best way to promote humanism in X country is to have a thriving humanist organization which understands the local culture, traditions, language, so on, and can promote humanism and the ideas of tolerance and an open society within that given culture. So we like I said, we have this growth and development program. So we engage with humanists all around the world, and we help them to set up an organization or to get going with campaigns and so on. And then we network them together so they can learn from different campaigns and techniques from each other, and to help share ideas and move things forward. So that's kind of how we do it. We think that the best thing to do is to support the development and emergence of new humanist organizations, and then to help them spread the message and to understand the ideas of tolerance.
Because
I think the other sorry,
no, you go.
I think the other thing is, I mean, it's difficult. It's almost an existential question for sort of politics as well at the moment, and I think
what I was going to say, sorry, I'm going to only because it's pertinent to what you're saying. So I think where the Humanist International position is one of looking at micro issues here and supporting the growth of these organizations, which is absolutely 100% brilliant, because that's what you can affect, right? That's what you can have control over. What you can't have control over is actually what we need to happen, which is a massive global shift, which comes from globalization, which comes from education, and you won't get good education until you've got good economics. I mean, it's why, as annoying as it has been that certain politicians say clever things, and I disagree with those politicians, but it's the economy stupid. So if you get the economy right, then you've got the money to be able to introduce welfare systems that will work to support everyone in society, and education systems that will allow you to educate your society. And through that, from your own report, through that, there's a correlation there, there's a causation there, that you will get a growing humanism or non-religion throughout the world. But how do you do that? You can't obviously affect those changes.
And there's an interesting Steven Pinker has a new book out looking at rationalism, and he's made a few good points, which is that it's often a sort of criticism that everything's going to hell these days. It's not as good as it used to be, and he's responded to some of those concerns on the idea of rationalism.
Is that in Enlightenment Now? His book Enlightenment Now?
No, there's a new book. It's called Rationalism: Why It Seems Scarce, Why It's Important, and What It Is, or something. I can't remember the full title. He gave a talk about it to our AGM this year, yes. And he made the point, which was really interesting, which was, okay, progressive people looking at politics these days, so as I would imagine, you can despair the rise of nationalism and the blurred lines of what's truth and what's not truth, fake news, all these different things, and you could throw your hands up and think, God, the concept of rationalism and truth and all these things, it just seems to have completely disappeared. And he makes the point, well, in some areas it might seem like that, but also, like, we have never had a much higher level of technological ability. Like, even a few years ago, the idea that you and I would have this conversation remotely so easily and feel so comfortable talking to each other, it wouldn't really have been possible 10 years ago, let's say. So in many areas of life, we have never been more rational. Like the phone that most people have in their hands, you've never had a better sophisticated technology. And like what you mentioned, in terms of economic progress, it's clear that if you're a country, if you're a leader of a government now, and you want to provide for the people of your country, you need rationalism. You need scientific rationalism, because that's the only way you'll progress your economy. And you need evidence-based policy and thinking and so on. But then at the same time, there is obviously this emerging trend in politics for this completely delusional, fake news. There's no such thing as truth. You can just say anything you want. And how do you sort of reattach those two things? I don't know the answer to that, but I know that that's what we need to do. But
yes, yeah. It is tough, but I suppose it's doing what you have the power to do. So in terms of Humanists International, that is, supporting those. I wrote some articles a few years back on, I think, is it Uganda that has a couple of humanist schools.
Yes, yeah.
And you're thinking Uganda, because they've got a really a not progressive president or prime minister, with anti-gay agendas and all sorts of things going on there. But they got a couple of humanist schools, and that it's sort of supporting that growth, because that's important for there to be tangible humanism. you know, real tangible humanism. It's not just this idea that exists up here and you got like intellectuals going, well, you should be humanist. It's like, here's a school, you know, educating children and providing for the local community, and it's humanist, you know.
Yeah. And I think there's many reasons, I think, to be optimistic that we are moving, that humanism is becoming a more important aspect of culture. So I mean, one example that's just on my mind recently is many companies around the world are now reviewing their working arrangements, because of the past 2 years people have been working at home and different things. And in the past, you had to just go to work in whatever conditions were available, and you were just expected to satisfy the need of your employer, and you got some money. But if you think about all the different conversations that are happening now around employee well-being, and, you know, where is the balance right between how to, you know, have a happy, healthy, nurtured staff that can, you know, look after their children or do their hobbies or whatever it is, and also satisfy the needs of the employer. Like, you can see that's a much more humanistic way of approaching life, and it's, you know, it's much more understanding of the fact that life isn't just about creating widgets. It's also about personal fulfillment. It's about, you know, the satisfaction and having a fulfilled feeling about.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I work as in part-time in civil service, and that's really strongly encouraged, like hugely, like impressively so. But of course, that, you know, this is the importance of regulation, decent regulation. So, you know, as a government organization, they're happy to do that, and it's in their best interest. You know, it's trying to make sure that that gets through to the free market, so that there are. It's about making all these things economically attractive as well, isn't it? It's how green economy, you know, it's how we green the economy, because, you know, we need to make it financially viable. You know, how do we well-being the economy? We need to make it for, you know, productive employees are employees that have better well-being, and you know, that have the work-life balance, so on and so forth. So yeah, I think there's this interesting mix of the free market, interesting mix of the economy and all these good values, but also the question is how do we get that throughout every sort of financial organization, you know, in certainly in countries that don't seem to like regulation. Yeah. Anyway, that's a big economic political discussion. I was going to say that I found this an interesting statement in the opening to the report. So the apparent absence of non-religious voices may well indicate that non-religious are self-censoring their views in response to oppressive laws or social taboo, or that they are being actively silenced, as this report documents all too often. So there's this idea that sometimes the fact that there aren't many voices might not be that they are being stifled. There's some systemic thing in place. So on the face value, you might not realize. You might look at a country and say, oh, there aren't very many humanist people there, but then there aren't very many rules that discriminate against them. So, you know, nothing to worry about here. But actually, it might be reflective of these sort of social discriminations and things that are in place. So do you have any views on that?
Yes, that's a very interesting one. It reminds me of a conference I was at, which I won't say which conference, but it was a conference of policy makers in the Netherlands. And I was told very confidently that I was talking about the need for policymakers to understand the kind of thing I was saying earlier, that when thinking about equal treatment of religions, you also must take into account the fact that there are non-religious people and they also deserve equal treatment. And I was told very confidently, I was talking, I think, specifically about Nigeria, I forget why, but anyway, I was told very confidently that, oh, no. People in Nigeria are very religious. It's very important to them. There aren't any humanists in Nigeria. Now, I know that's not true, but and this person was not Nigerian, but there's this idea that, and it's a really problematic idea, actually, of just sort of painting people with the same brush. But yes, there is obviously, in any society, in any culture that we've looked at, there have been a collection of people which we now call humanists. There've been rationalists, there've been, you know, agnostics, and so on and so on. And there's no reason to believe that there aren't groups or individuals like that nowadays. We've been very active on this issue recently, and a couple of countries have invited us to come and train their diplomats, because people are now more aware that when they go to do, for example, a foreign mission on trade deals or some sort of, bilateral deal, they will often ask about, the rights of minorities, LGBT people, women. Women are not a minority, of course, but I mean, they will ask about groups which are traditionally persecuted, because they want to ensure that the trade deal has mechanisms which push up the human rights condition of a
That's
country.
brilliant.
And we've now been invited on a couple of occasions to train them on, here's questions to ask about humanists and non-religious people. So that's a good
That's
thing.
fantastic. I mean, it's something else that I think was a really interesting point here, and actually there are links to the UK in terms of the House of Lords. In fact, discrimination against the non-religious is often caused not by a desire to hurt atheists, but by a desire to help one or more religions. For example, as a result of its 15-year-long civil war, and with a view to bringing peace to the country, the entire system of government in Lebanon is based on sectarian quotas, with different rights and roles available to Sunni Muslims, Shiite Muslims, and Maronite Christians, etc., etc. This practice not only codifies and encourages religious discrimination, but it also discourages people from leaving the religion of their birth, because they will lose all the state privileges that come with belonging to that religion. So not only do humanists not get given a certain quota of seats in parliament, and therefore don't get political representation structurally, systematically, but they are more likely to pretend to be a religion that they are not, adhering to a worldview that they don't, in order to have power, representation, meaning, purpose in a kind of like practical sense in their lives. And that is interesting, I thought. And in the House of Lords, we have, what is it, 19 or 29 permanent lords who are Christian, who are priests or of religious denomination. That's baked into our own system,
Yeah,
to a smaller degree.
If I can, I mean, I think that's fascinating. If I can take it back to the parochial example of the west of Scotland, but it's a similar one to Lebanon. So we spoke at the start about the problems with and it applies across the whole UK, of the way which the religious school system is done in policy terms leads to all these weird discriminations. Let's add another element of complexity to it, which is I mentioned that my family are sort of traditional Irish Catholics. So my grandfather came over here as an immigrant some years ago. When Irish Catholics came to the west of Scotland originally, they were severely discriminated against. So the classic sort of historical thing is you would see signs on people's doors saying no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. And this was the idea that Irish people were, and the Church of Scotland at the time, which, because Scotland didn't have a parliament, was considered the sort of, well, considered by some the voice of the people and so on. So they passed many motions condemning what they called the menace of the Irish race. So from the pulpits and from semi-official platforms, Irish Catholic immigrants were severely stigmatized and discriminated against. And some people will say, and I think with good reason, that you can still see the long-lasting effects of that discrimination today, with Irish Catholic descendants being poorer and less healthy and so on. Anyway, the reason to say that is because in 1919, the Catholic school system was introduced as a protective measure. It was introduced in the teeth of opposition from some people in the Protestant community. It was introduced to protect and defend and nurture the well-being and rights of Catholic people, or Irish Catholic descendants and so on. So here's an interesting thing, is that there is within lived memory in this part of Scotland the understanding that challenging the Catholic school system reawakens memories of discrimination and horrific abuse against the Irish Catholic community. So yeah, I think there's an interesting one there, because there's a defense of why that was taken, which is understandable, despite the fact that there are now problems with how that is working in practice. So it's a very interesting thing to sort of reflect on these.
Yeah, and so I suppose unpicking, saying, well, actually, this Catholic school system, for example, is discriminating against, or is feeding tribalism, whatever. We need to sort of, get rid of this in some sense. And the Catholic, society, communities will be, hang on, this is our defense mechanism, this is part and parcel of why we exist, or how we got a foothold in this part of Scotland. So yeah, there are interesting social and historical tensions that exist in what might seem like a very higher, different level of conversation, but it evokes very parochial and historical and social memories.
Yeah, and I think in that way it's similar to what you mentioned there, because it's largely unintentional, I would presume. I don't think the people who wrote the legislation in 1919 could have fast forwarded in their minds, and I don't think they would have been particularly minded for equality for gay people, but they wouldn't have seen it as purposefully discriminating against them. So yeah, it's very complicated. Is the short answer.
So are you hopeful for the future in terms of, I know the report can be seen to be depressing by point of fact that it's pointing out the challenges that humanists and non-religious people face throughout the world, but do you feel in your bones that the future is bright and enlightened?
I am optimistic, I have to be honest. Within our network, it's never been stronger. We've never had more active and engaged members in countries around the world. We have more members in more countries now than ever before that are active and thriving and network together and a real progressive force. We do feel very much at the heart of a genuine global movement of people here. So I feel very optimistic about us. And like I said before, our ideas are not controversial. We are trying to push forward on all fronts for a better world for everybody. And I think we have seen, we've spoken mostly about sort of problematic or extreme groups and so on today, but there are many progressive religious groups, or also just progressive secular organizations that are now partnering with us to help us achieve those goals, or we help them, and vice versa. So I am very optimistic about what we're doing. Also, the way in which in recent years the pandemic, I think, shook everybody. It made us aware of our vulnerabilities, but also the fact that we are now a global world. We are a globalized, interconnected world, and I think that has given people a sense of expanding the sort of ethical considerations around the world. And also with COP26 and the climate change crisis coming to the fore, we now understand that we do need to be acting as a kind of global community here and with a mind to the future. So I am optimistic, and I think we've got good things ahead of us.
I know it's a dirty word to some, and I never understand why, but intersectionality is important. Mm-hmm. It's that there are so many ways in which movements intersect and overlap. And you talk about the climate there, the climate crisis. Surely that should be at the forefront of any organization's project and plan for the future. There's an element of sustainability both in terms of the environment and in terms of any organization, but the environment should be considered, for example. And so yeah, it's interesting that seems to be the way that you're going, which is working together with other organizations, but also having a multifaceted understanding of where you are going as an organization. If I can sort of finish up by asking, what do you think, what are you most proud of succeeding? What do you think is the best success story that the Humanists International have had? Or if that's too difficult because it's too much of an umbrella organization that doesn't do individual things, it's more about sort of bringing everyone together. What have you been most yes for any particular humanist organization around the world? What's a great success story that you can give us?
I think one thing that I could say this year is it maybe sounds a bit technocratic, but the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, which is like the UN expert on religion and philosophy, let's say, who writes reports and stuff that's taken very seriously by the United Nations and countries around the world. He wrote his report on freedom of thought, and it was very much, so he did consultations with humanist organizations around the world. He took into consideration the persecution of humanists, but also the way in which ideas and freedom of thought is construed of, and the importance of philosophical inquiry and personal meaning making and so on. He wrote his annual report specifically on that this year, and that comes on the back of years and years of quiet diplomatic lobbying, of writing reports and so on. I mean, that in short, that to me has been a major success, and I think if you look over the 70-year history of this organization, I think that will stand out as a really important milestone.
So sort of validating yourselves, validating your project, and giving yourself, in a sense, a chair at the table.
Exactly.
If only by proxy, you know. Yeah.
And when we were founded in 1952, I know you're wrapping up, so I'll just be quick. But
no, I'll do what take as long as you like, mate.
We had the first resolution that was passed by that Congress in 1952 says we want to be engaged with the United Nations, with UNESCO and so on. We want to be engaged with a diplomatic, universalist sort of approach, pragmatic approach, which is engaged with these institutions, right? And that very much framed the way that we've worked for the last 70 years. So we, for example, we don't do, you know, shouting and in your face sort of campaigning and you know, that's an approach which works for some people, but that's not our approach. Our approach is that, for example, with the last administration in the US, we took the approach of let's continue to quietly, meaningfully engage, to push forward our agenda, even although we knew it was not a receptive audience. And that's
like
always been our
quiet competence.
Exactly. We try to be, we've tried to muster as much expertise as we can with the small resources we have, and we try to just push forward with a confident, sort of well thought out, researched agenda. When it can be tempting to, you know, throw your hands up in the air and call people out and so on, that our approach has always been to engage multilaterally with officials and kind of try and push things forward. And I think for me, the report this year was a vindication of that. Now, you need other people. Obviously, you need people who are much more activist on the ground, who are pointing out, you know, hypocrisy and raising concerns and stuff. But I think for us, it's always been about that kind of pushing forward with the reports and the officials and the papers and things. And it's good to see that that's bearing fruit now, and that we're, you know, our concerns are being taken seriously.
So what could an individual, someone watching this video, what could they do to help? Is it a case of joining their national humanist organization that then feeds into, you know, it's not like the Humanists International would be, you know, taking members. They don't take individual members from countries. So it's about joining a local humanist organization and national humanist organization to in order to affect change sort of globally. Can someone help to affect global change by what they do locally and nationally?
That's right. So the best way to get involved is to, as you say, join your national organization. If you go onto our website, you can find a local group near you. Our website is humanists.international, but if you just Google us, you'll find us. The other way you can join is if you want to support the work that we do directly, you can join us as a supporter. So it's not a member because we don't have individual members, but you can become a supporter. So for $5 or £5 or €5 per month, you can get on our mailing list. You know, you can attend our events and get, you know, involved in the work that we do and consultations. And we mentioned the freedom of thought report, so we rely on a team of volunteers to help us with the editorial approach and different things, and we're always looking for any help that we can get. So if you want to get involved in that way, you can go onto our website, click support. You can sign up for $5 a month and get access to our mailing lists, find out what's going on, volunteer to help out with different things. So there are a number of ways you can get involved, but primarily we exist to support national humanist organizations, which is the best route for getting involved in activism and so on. But yes, if you want to support us, we'd be very happy.
And what it sounds really worthy. What national organisation are you most happy that's come on board recently? Is there, because I presume humanist organisations only exist in a certain number of countries. Are you happy? When you see a new one start up in a country, do you go, "Whoa, yeah"?
Yeah. So, God, that's a really interesting question. one of the organizations which I think joined us, it was either this year or last year. The join process is quite long, I should say, because once you become a member as an organization, you get access to a lot of funding and resources and stuff. So the join process is quite, but one of the members which joined very recently and has had an absolutely fantastic year has been Humanists Barbados.
Oh, wow.
And they organized a national launch event for the Freedom of Thought report, which got a lot of press coverage and so on. And I have been thinking that maybe we should do a working visit there sometime to check out how learn good successes and so on.
Mate,
but
your
been...
Scottish skin wouldn't last.
But yeah, that's been an amazing achievement. Trying to think, I mean, there's humanist organizations in a lot of countries that people I think would be quite surprised about.
Really?
Yeah.
Fair enough. So just to end up, I thought, let's have some quick fire questions for you, Gary. Questions that you don't have too long to answer. It's got to be intuitive. Okay. So what's your favorite nonfiction book?
It would be the Ian Rankin series, the detective series. I'm forgetting his name.
That's fiction. That's question 2. That's your fiction.
Oh, book. Sorry, non-fiction. Sorry. The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker.
Oh, I'm going to write that down because
it's a sort of it's a book based on psychoanalysis about the theory being that the repressed fear of death is what motivates people to embark on ego projects.
Oh, Becker. Is he not involved in terror management theory? So which is mortality salience. So this is the understanding that the existential threat of death. And it's an argument for religion that it gives you that comfort blanket of eternal life, and atheism just can't compete with that. It's like, what are you promising us when we die? Worm food, or if you're lucky, you might get burnt in a crematorium. So that's a tough sell, but truth hurts. So there's this idea that I'm sure Becker's mentioned.
That does sound very familiar to that book.
Yeah, so I'm sure he's mentioned in talking about terror management theory, which is you get this idea of mortality salience. So it's your understanding of your own mortality and how that interacts with your psyche.
Yeah, because I think that that idea of like having an awareness of your ego and how to manage it within the confines of a rational understanding of the world and your eventual death. We talked about the politics and stuff and the rise of nationalism. I think there's so much that could be helped in the world, especially people who lead us, by having more of a way of talking about ego management and understanding all that stuff. So I don't know, that's a sort of personal interest I have.
Lovely. Oh, brilliant. And Ian Rankin, you say for fiction book, how about favorite film?
One of my favorite, it seems like it is the 1970 Cromwell movie.
Oh my goodness, I wasn't expecting that.
Yeah. It's like Alec Guinness and stuff, and it's a kind of old 1970s epic about Cromwell.
And his puritanical, is it sort of looking critically at him, or does it portray him as a nuanced, complex character? Or
it's critical of him as a a kind of vicious warlord and ideologue. But I don't know, I think there's just something like the way it's done is quite camp and it's quite funny, and it's like Alec Guinness's performance is brilliant. I don't know, I just quite enjoy it. It's not a very intellectual one though. I should have picked something a bit more impressive.
No, I would have gone for like Aliens, second one. Loads of guns. Aliens and Ripley going mental. It's brilliant.
That is a good one.
Or With Nell and I think I'd throw in there. It's got to be a classic. I don't know. So many films. Depends. I always think it depends what mood you're in. It's like favorite album. It's like, well, exactly. It depends kind of what mood I'm in. Okay. Last meal.
What did I have last night?
Not your last meal. The last meal.
Oh, the last meal I would have.
Last meal you would have if you're going to die.
Wow. Something light, I guess. Oh, that's difficult.
Well, something light, I guess. What was that?
I know.
It's because
want to be overeaten.
Just because when I run through the pearly gates, I need to be really fit.
Exactly.
Not very fit.
Well, that's a really difficult question. I don't know. I guess it would be like.
To be honest, I thought that was like the most simple question I've got.
Really? It would probably be something homely like mince and potatoes or something.
I don't know. Are you trying to be Scottish?
Nah, I don't know. Does that sound particularly Scottish?
Mince and potatoes. I don't know. It sounds. I don't... Okay, so if you had you can take up to 3 people into a bunker with you because there's an apocalypse coming. What 3 people? And you can live with them for a month.
Blimey. What's the chap that does the bushcraft skills? The British guy.
Oh, what's his face? Yeah, him. Oh, come on, yeah, him.
Him.
Well, I don't know.
Brown.
You haven't got a lot of like bush in a bunker.
But... Well, that's true. Actually, I don't know. I suppose you would want some good conversation. I've always wanted to have a conversation with Darren Brown. I thought that'd be fascinating.
Yeah.
Somebody who's good at fixing things. I don't know.
Is it Bear Grylls or Ray Mears? Which one?
Ray Mears.
Okay.
And who else would it be?
Ray Mears, Darren Brown, and someone who's good at fixing things.
Yeah. Oh, I should say my boyfriend.
Oh, right. There you go. Well, that would it's something of an afterthought. I'm not sure. I'm not sure I'd appreciate that. Oh yeah, and I suppose I should say, but I wouldn't have otherwise. But I should now. I don't know whether I'd take someone I disagree with quite a lot, because I reckon I'd get, like a rabbi, an imam, and a Catholic priest, and just like, let's go for it.
Sounds like a fantastic joke.
A humanist, an imam, a Catholic priest, a rabbi stuck in a bunker.
Wow,
what's the punchline? Okay. Well, look, thank you, Gary. It's been a real pleasure. Perhaps we can do this again sometime and talk about something else. I've certainly enjoyed this. I hope you have got something out of it and it's been useful for you.
Definitely.
Do you have anything you want to add? Any way people can get hold of you if you want to get hold of a ball of? I mean, other people have Twitter accounts and this and that. I don't know. Is that a thing you do?
No, I'm not on social media, but if you want to contact me, you can contact me through Humanists International. It's very easy to get hold of me if you want. But yeah, check out our website. You can find out how to become a supporter or to get involved with a local group. And yeah, thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, well, look, thank you so much for your time. I've really enjoyed it. I've learned a lot, and good luck with everything you do in the future.
Thanks, Jonathan.